morning to our Caron YouTube audience and to those of you who are with us this morning on live stream and in person for the 19th of December 2021. The various sacred calendars in the northern hemisphere seem to pay attention to the coming of the winter solstice, which is on the 21st, 22nd. And for us, I think many of us are like, yeah, that at least is a turn from the shortening of the daylight hours. And so pretty soon, although the winter will stay cold for the next couple of months, at least daylight will start to increase. I'm looking forward to that very much, and I hope that you are as well. The concurrence of that in the Christian calendars is with the celebration of the birth of Jesus, a peculiar and interesting sort of part of the Christian tradition, and lovely stories that have all kinds of meaning and value and purpose. And this is the fourth of a series of Countdown Sundays to Friday evening celebration of the Nativity, which we will have a celebration of here on campus for our patient community. And also there's a topic for today, which happens to be servanthood, and it's a good fit for some of the readings that we're bringing and something I want to talk about. So if I can meander my way into the topic, I'd like to tell you about somebody I've never talked about at chapel before, but who embodies for me much of those confluent streams that are coming together on this particular day. And his name was, for me, Uncle Jim. So my dad was one of three brothers. John, he was the oldest, was my dad, Joe, the middle brother, and Jim, the youngest. And they were each the sons of Herb and Ann, and I think it's, without being pejorative in any way, I think it's a fair guess to say probably addiction was a part of the history of that family. Certainly my dad, I think, was aware even himself of having the affliction that brings us to this gathering here today. And my dad was never able to sort of cease his consumption of alcohol or medications and died too young. Anyway, I just want to tell you a little bit about the family and talk about his younger brother, Jim. So my dad was the oldest, and he was the son of a college professor. So my grandpa taught Latin and Greek in Catholic universities, and was a super smart guy. Both, actually. My dad was very intelligent, and my grandfather was like consummately academic. And my other uncle, Joe, was athletic and business smart. So both Joe and John were kind of the, worldly success types of the family, to the extent that our family had any worldly success. We were not one percenters. We were not people in the upper echelon. We were not folks who, even enjoyed the kind of creature comforts of like vacation homes and faraway places or anything like that. But my dad became a college professor and then a businessman, sort of emulating my grandfather's brilliance. And then my Uncle Joe became a career employee of Illinois Bell. It was one of the Bell telephone companies, and served in his career until he retired from there and did very, very well. And he was a father of 8 kids, and very, very Catholic family too. And my other uncle, Jim, was the sort of hidden child and a little bit the scapegoat of the three of them, as far as I understand the little dynamics, for reasons that became clear to me as I got older and I understood more of Jim's story. You see, Jim suffered from, and was only diagnosed later in his life because it only became the kind of thing that people understood later on, was diagnosed with a learning challenge. I think that's the right language these days. He was quite profoundly dyslexic, which the irony of it is he was a typing teacher. And it's okay to laugh. So he would have laughed hysterically at it. And my Uncle Jim was an unbelievable success in a very different kind of way than either Joe, his Illinois Bell career or my dad with his academic and business pursuits. Jim, in order to find his way, decided to pursue a religious life. And so when he was a young man, he pledged vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience in a community of Roman Catholic men that is still centered in Dayton, Ohio. And my Uncle Jim took his vows when he was a young man and lived in that community for the rest of his life. And I don't know how much any of you know about ordered Catholic life, but if you're a Catholic priest, you may be either an ordered priest or a diocesan priest. They come in two different flavors. And the orders are priests who live in communities and take these vows of poverty, whereas the diocesan priests are a little bit more like structured in their ministries like ministers and priests and rabbis in other religions and denominations. So they gather salaries and they live kind of by themselves. And there's parallels but differences. So Father Bill, whose portrait is over there, was an ordered priest. And some of the orders that you may have heard of if you've ever, like, even if you don't know anything about this, many of us hear about people like the Franciscans or the Dominicans or the Benedictines or whatever. These are more commonly, or the Jesuits. I believe the current Pope was a Jesuit. And so those are very, very much the better known orders. Father Bill was a member of an order called the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales. My Uncle Jim professed his vows in a community that were called Marianists. And the Marianists followed, the beginning of that word is the Mary, the mother of Jesus. Their principal devotion was following Mary, the mother of Jesus. And when he took his vows, I think it was assumed that he would study and perhaps become a priest. But eventually his difficulties with written learning became so evident that he was supported by his order to remain what they call a brother. So my uncle was a brother his whole life. He never became Father Jim. He was always Brother Jim. And his whole ministry was teaching in inner city schools in Cincinnati, Ohio. Predominantly, that was where he spent most of his life. And there was a school in Cincinnati that he used to write us. He would write us these long letters on his typewriter, using his typewriting skills on mimeograph paper. If any of you remember, it looks like purple stuff, and it would run off. And then he would send them to all the people on his list. So I would get Uncle Jim letters, and other people would. And he would tell us about the play he was working on, and also the inner city ministries that he would do. Not only did he teach at this school in the inner city of Cincinnati, but he elected to live over the Rhine, so across the state line in a tough neighborhood that was, I think, called East Cincinnati or whatever, but it's actually the adjoining state. And people were like, Brother Jim, are you sure you want to live down there? And he's like, absolutely, I'm fine, I'm happy to, because we have a house down there, and I don't want to take away somebody's room. And so this was this dude's, like, that's how he rolled, was he epitomized a life of devotional service. And one of the fun stories of my life was maybe about 7 or 8 years ago. I happened to be in Cincinnati. I was invited by the federal government's Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration to do a teaching for churches on addiction with a really cool woman who set up these teachings around the country. And I was honored by the invitation, and so she called me and said, hey, would you want to do another one of these? Because we had done them in West Virginia and other places. I was like, sure. And she said, well, the next one's in Cincinnati. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. So I flew to Cincinnati to be a part of this workshop, and we had this big auditorium rented, and we were training pastors and representatives of churches on how to respond to addiction with some information and intelligence, teach about Narcan and all that stuff. And we had a nice long lunch, and I had a rental car. And so I said to, what was her name? Sid. I said to Sid, I'm going to take the car out for lunch and I'll be back. And she said, why? And I said, well, I just need to go check something out. And I looked up on the map, and I was only like 3 miles from the school where my uncle had spent most of his life teaching. It was called St. Petronell. So I get in the car, and I drive to this school, and it's, of course, it's an inner city Catholic school, and there's a big fence and gate, and I'm figuring, I'll never get in. But I go up and I think, what the heck, and I ring the doorbell, and some guy comes to the door, and I said, hi, cold call, sorry to do this, but I just happened to be in the neighborhood, and my uncle used to teach here, and I thought, I would come and see if there was anybody here. And he goes, well, who is your uncle? And I said, my uncle is Jim Abel. And he goes, oh, brother Jim, you're related to him? And I was like, yeah, I'm his nephew. And he's like, come on inside. So he took me in, he showed me pictures of my uncle who was there. And this guy was the principal of the school, and he had been a student of the school. And he had come out of the school, gone to college, succeeded, and decided to come back to the inner city neighborhood to give back as a part of his teaching ministry. And he had participated in some of the plays that my uncle had facilitated. And so he's like, this was Uncle Jim's drama department, and it was just an amazing thing. So, that's a little bit of a snapshot of this person who was so important in my life. And every once in a while, Uncle Jim would get this impulse, and he would call my mom, who loved him, and they were close. So my mom's brother-in-law, and he would say, Reenie, that was my mother's name, was Irene. Reenie, I'm coming by. Cincinnati to Pennsylvania was a long, 12, 14-hour drive at that time. And she'd say, okay, when are you coming? And he'd say, I think I'll be there Saturday night. Well, invariably, Friday he would show up. And he would have driven through the night, just hilarious, and we would be so excited to see him, and it was, we would feed him good food, home-cooked meals, and he would tell us stories, and I have these memories of him with the materials that he would have by his bedside in the guest room of our house. And he would sit there with me and he would say, Jackie, I want to show you this. This is a new statue on the property either of our provincial house or of the school. And they were these statues of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And the statues meant so much to my uncle and I think he was trying to evangelize me in a certain way. And the three images that I remember of the statues of Mary were, and they're the classic images of Marian art. Mary with the baby Jesus at Christmas, Mary with the dying Jesus, which is an image that's called the Pietà in the later part of the story. And then also Mary with various depictions of open arms. The Mary who welcomes the sick and the suffering, and the Mary of sort of eternity. And Uncle Jim would say, we just put this statue on there, and I go and I pray by it, and when I pray for you and your grandparents and your, you kids and all that stuff. And I was always impressed by his testimony to his devotions, but I was clueless. And as I grew into my late teens, I became this rebellious, angry, bratty atheist, by the way. So that must have been hard for him to watch. And he was so overjoyed he lived long enough to see me get sober and then go to the seminary and turn my life in a different direction. The only other thing I wanted to say about Mary was I learned when I was in seminary that Mary is viewed by some of the branches of Christian life, especially the Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox, by a term they call Theotokos, which means mother of God. So there are parts of the Christian churches that think of Mary in this extremely high way. And what that does, which is interesting in the current socio-political environment, is it introduces an element of the feminine in the divine that's quite beautiful. And it's been one of the critiques of Christianity over many centuries is its emphasis on the masculine, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But the Orthodox Christian community's veneration of Mary as the mother of God is a nice little counterbalance to that. So here I am, and I'm standing in front of you, and I'm wanting to tell you at this time of year, and sitting in these red chairs in this historic auditorium about how service impacted my life through the witness of my Uncle Jim. How service has its expression in his community through the image of Mary. And I want to also tie it up a little tighter to addiction. And my way of suggesting that that's easily done is to just point out that one of my favorite ways of talking about addiction is misplaced attachment. Addiction is us kind of falling in love with the wrong thing. So addiction, like the heroin addict, loves and hates the heroin. I loved and hated the cocaine. I loved and hated the alcohol. And one can be in a marriage and have that love. It's almost like the opposite of love is indifference, not hate. So a bitter, painful entanglement is addiction. And what I'm going to say is that I believe the 12 steps, and I believe my uncle's life, and I believe that also, like Buddhism, I think the wisdom traditions of the world call us to fall in love with helping other people. Call us to fall in love with being of service. As an antidote to the pile of presents under the tree, or the strivings of material accomplishment, or the, having the perfect hair or body image, or all of the different things that or getting the right drugs, or and that the deepest satisfaction of the human life is found in this selfless service. And there is a little problem, I will admit. Years ago, I used to have a lecture, and it was about the very thing I'm trying to talk about, which is that addiction is this transformation of a life from self-centeredness to selflessness. And on the slide, on the lecture, there was a bullet that said something like submission, obedience, and servitude. And there was a woman who was sitting in the middle of the auditorium over there who came up to me after the lecture, and she said, I have a real problem with that one bullet. And she was a victim of domestic violence and trauma. And I had never thought of it, when I put it on the slide, in the sense of servitude as being enforced servitude. What I'm talking about is not the servitude that a boss imposes on an employee, or that a tyrant imposes on a subject, or that a perpetrator imposes on a victim. I'm talking about a servitude that comes out of the desire that we have to find the pleasure that comes, a voluntary choice that we make to give, because giving is this unbelievably rich form of receiving. And that's really the whole of my message today, is that upside down idea that when people talk about Caron, this magic mountain, or when they talk about how much they love this guy whose portrait is over here, Father Bill Holbert, the reason that Father Bill was so profoundly loved, I think, by so many, is that, like my uncle, he had made this decision to turn his entire life around to being of service every minute of every day. He did it better than I do it, and he did it better than probably anybody who's ever been around. I got to pal around him really close for year after year, and there were times when he would annoy me and I would annoy him or whatever, but I marveled when one of you would come up to him, even when he was tired, when he was sick, when he was when I knew there were circumstances behind the curtain that would have given him reason to be irritable or short-tempered or whatever. He had this dedication to sharing love. He was a bright bulb in the box of humanity. And I'm not saying that you are dark bulbs in the box of humanity, but I'm guessing we could all improve. And I'm guessing that if you look back on your addictive period, that generosity and selflessness decreased in that time. And I'm going to tell you that if generosity and selflessness were to increase in the near term, it will please you in a way that's astonishing and can be maybe the best high, way better than the highs from a good martini or whatever. So that's the call that we have, is to find in this week as Christmas comes upon us and the solstice turn happens, an opportunity to shift from darkness to light and from selfishness to love of one another. And I really believe it's the way. So in a funny way, of all of the three of my dad and my two uncles, no disrespect to my dad, I loved him and admired him so much, but in terms of values, the one I admired the most was my Uncle John. He was the least and the most. And, thanks very much.